Hey everyone, welcome back to another edition of the Geointerview. Today we have with us a renowned expert on Indo-Pacific security issues, Dr. Frédéric Grare. Dr. Grare is a senior fellow from the ANU National Security College, Canberra. He has led numerous research projects and positions extensively focusing on the geopolitical and the security dynamics of the Indo-Indian Ocean region. Sir, it is our honor to have you here with us. How are you doing today?
Very good, thank you, and thank you for having me.
Let's come down to the focus on the Indo-Pacific region, because the region has been currently following the dramatic geopolitical hotspots on the world stage. Given your expertise in the security dynamics, what are the factors behind region's current geopolitical and defense dynamics, especially when we talk about from the prism of the regional power relations?
Well, I don't think there is any mystery to that or anything particularly original to say about this. This is all about China's rise and the way different power react to it, depending how they anticipate relation for their own status. So China's rise is seen as a threat by the US. China's rise is seen as a threat by India, as a way of consequence for the first rivalry, and so on and so forth. So this is why the region has, well, if we can call it a region, but this is why it has become not a hotspot so much, but a source of concern for the world stability and so on. We have the two largest economies and the two largest military in the world facing each other in what we call the Indo-Pacific, and therefore the big question is war between the two inevitable? Are the tensions that we currently face likely to lead to a conflict, and so on and so forth? And therefore, everything is interpreted through that lens, and everybody reacts accordingly. So we see a growing trend towards militarization. We see growing tension. We see what we did consider the post-war world order being threatened, and so on and so forth. And that leads to sort of a dialectic between China and the rest of the world, which is the one that we see every day, and the situation that we are facing.
So it's an important point when you raise, especially the regional dynamics of this particular region is not a mystery. When we talk about the importance of geopolitics, geoeconomics, and especially if you focus on the diplomacy of this region, when we consider it from the prism of China, so how in a world with the growing geopolitical and geoeconomic tensions, and especially if you look forward in the from the prism of international diplomacy and organizations, do you feel that enhancing military power and relations is an ideal way to make the region less volatile? And when we consider this from the prism of Thucydides trap and especially the theoretical concepts of it.
Militarization certainly doesn't make the world less volatile. Quite the contrary, but it's a symptom more than a cause. And we are just facing sort of a major security dilemma there. Whatever all countries do to reinforce the security is seen as a threat by others. So whatever China does in order to, let's say, secure the strategic gain of its economic growth is seen by other powers as a threat, and therefore they tend to reinforce their own capacities themselves. So we are in that situation where this is not going to be avoided. So this is not just the result of a stupid decision one day to just militarize. Things do not happen this way. But I mean, this is the way this is the dynamic that we see now. That's certainly something which can be probably not escaped, but probably mitigated, something that can be weakened through dialogue, through insistence on the existing norm, and so on. But it's something that we are witnessing day by day with some measure of anxiety, I must say.
Given the current context of China and the rise of China since 1980s, and especially when we come down to 1985, 1990s, China has recently grown by, especially in terms of its GDP, by tenfolds. When we consider the economic reforms of Deng Xiaoping and its rise, China's rise as a global power, especially after Deng announced three modernizations of its economy. we see that gradually there is a bit of a bit of an hegemonic status of China in this, especially in this region, especially when we consider its dominance of the global value chains, supply chains, and other areas of international partnerships as well. If we consider this from the prism of the Belt and Road Initiative in the Southeast Asian region, and especially the South Asian region, the story remains very similar. In such a context, how do you think that the recent example of military partnerships across the Indo-Pacific regions and the infrastructural problems can help can impact the region's security till now, especially when we consider sub challenges, especially emerging from China and other extraterritorial powers in the region?
Well, there are just not one, but several questions in this one. Let me start with the partnerships. I mean, the partnerships that are the most significant are the ones that you know. China itself has no partnership of any real significance, unless you consider that Pakistan is one of them, but I don't think that can be counted as such. Now, if we speak of the meaningful military partnership in the region, you're speaking, of course, of the US alliances, bilateral, US-Japan, US-Korea, and so on and so forth, the partnership which are being developed over the past few years, for example, with India and so on, plus the partnership with other countries. And of course, you have this big apex, not organization, not anything that can be easily defined, which is the quadrilateral security dialogue. It's not clear at this stage that the Quad is really more than the addition of the bilateral relations that the United States entertain with each of the members, Japan, of course, Australia, India. But at the same time, it does underline once more the centrality of the US on the one side, and this is sending a political signal to China as well. This is what we can describe as the major partnership of the time. This is not exclusive of other partnerships, of course, which are developing in the region, but I mean, this is probably the most significant. What was the second part of the question, please, when you were speaking of infrastructure?
The second part of the question was actually basically we actually asked about the partnerships in the Indo-Pacific region, and how exactly do you think the infrastructural projects will impact such equations and geopolitical narratives in the region?
Well, it has impacted the narrative through the BRI, essentially. I mean, the BRI is the major Chinese project that I fed into the narrative of the Indo-Pacific and so on. The idea that China was not just creating trade links with the country in which it was creating infrastructure, but also potentially creating dual infrastructure that would help it prevent access to some countries in part of the world and so on and so forth, is really what fed the Indo-Pacific narrative. So that's the way it did act on it. And everything else is a reaction to that. Now, should we interpret it in such a systematic way? Maybe, maybe not. This is not always that clear. I mean, it's quite clear that since the mid-90s, China has been importing energy, whereas previously it was importing energy, but it was still mostly self-reliant. This is no longer the case. And it had to secure, of course, its own access to a source of energy and raw material, which is also what we observe. But you can't prevent state from having ulterior motive. The anarchy is the prevailing situation in the system, and therefore everybody wants to protect itself against everybody else, but in particular against China, because this is seen as, of course, the major threat right now.
Especially when you talk about the importance of AUKUS, the importance of Quad, the discussions becomes much more fluid. And Quad, especially with India's recent policy of strategic autonomy and various other neighbors in the region, especially with multiple non-state actors, with multiple state actors in the region. How do you exactly rank AUKUS and Quad into the equation? Because Quad is only promoting its relations in the scientific sector, in other sectors to to counteract China. But AUKUS is somewhat more to it, especially when we consider the submarine dealings of its and naval partnerships between three powers in the region: the United Kingdom, the Australians, and the United States. How do you rank between Quad and AUKUS in this particular initiative to
I mean,
counter China?
we're not talking about the same thing at all here. AUKUS is an arrangement between three countries in order to produce, among other things, a series of nuclear-propelled submarines. So this is a technical arrangement between the three. And of course, it probably has a China dimension, and it clearly has an anti-China dimension, but this is not the same thing as the Quad, which I perhaps should repeat is the quadrilateral security dialogue. And as such entails some cooperation, but it's not of the same nature. This is much more political. So we're simply not talking about the same thing. But I heard that you included in your question the notion of non-state actors, and I'm not sure how it fits into this whole conversation right now.
The non-state actors, especially, it's playing a very important role in this particular region. Especially, they are not into a much more fitting in the geopolitical context, especially when we consider about the political scene over here. But depending on that, we also talk about the importance of various other actors in the region. We have considered the importance of Quad. We have considered the importance of the AUKUS in the military setup. And the Chinese have actually categorized this particular Quad as an Asian NATO. And since NATO and also the other Quad is also has expanded its membership to include the regional partners in the region. So in that sense, where does Japan fit into this region, especially when you talk about the rising China, and it has to a certain extent bow down to Chinese pressures as well, especially it has several degree of disputes with the country. Where do you think Japan fits into this equation?
Japan is not part of AUKUS. Again, AUKUS is a technical arrangement for the build-up, or at least for Pillar 1, for the build-up of 8 nuclear submarines for and in Australia. So this is something which is, and it has nothing with the NATO of Asia. Where are the main Asian actors there? Is the UK an Asian actor? I don't think so. Are the main Asian actor Korea and Japan part of this arrangement? I don't think so. And not all of them are part of the Quad. So we're not there. It's part of the equivalent of this. This is nothing near what the Chinese are describing right now, even if they do understand that this is a potential threat to them as well. And it was meant to be. So the political messaging is there. But there is nothing comparable to NATO into this.
That's much more understandable when you categorize Quad as a political setup rather than a military setup. And it has a certain degree.
But it is not a political setup. It has, of course, some pre-political condition. That's one thing, but it's primarily a technical arrangement. This is something to build nuclear propelled submarine. So this is not, I don't overread AUKUS. AUKUS is part of something which has clearly an anti-China dimension, but AUKUS is not a political alliance. This is not an alliance at all. And none of the three countries which are part of it would describe it as an alliance. Alliance exists. A treaty between those three countries and others do exist already. This is not the point. This is a technical arrangement to build nuclear propelled submarines, plus a few other technologies which are included in Pillar 2. But this is not a political arrangement.
That's very much well understandable when you consider about the current regional setup. But let's come down from the state actors to the non-state actors. We usually see the higher degree of involvement of non-state actors in the region when you consider the rate of piracy near the Somalian coast, when we consider the rate of security and the geopolitical setup behind this particular whole equation. So considering these newly introduced variables and considering these new factors in this region, do you think there is a need for Quad and AUKUS to reinvent itself to make sure that they can counteract non-state actors in this region and eliminate such a threat? Because these actors not only cause a certain degree of problem for individual state actors as well, but they're a threat towards the free and open Indo-Pacific region. How do you think about the same?
I mean, you cannot confuse everything and say that, I mean, AUKUS is not meant to counter non-state actors. AUKUS is not meant to counter piracy. AUKUS is not meant to counter IU fishing and all those things. And all those non-traditional threats which fall under slightly different categories. This is slightly more debatable when it comes to Quad, which can bring about some lower level cooperation, such as maritime domain awareness and so on, which do help in the fight against piracy, for example, or other non-traditional threats. But this does not apply to AUKUS. So let's leave AUKUS aside if we speak of non-traditional threat, because this is not the point.
That's one of the sustained explanations by you. And when we consider now, let's come down to China again, and especially in the small nations. We see the political and economic investments of China in the region, especially across the Indian Ocean regions, be it in the Pacific Island states, be it in South Asian countries like Pakistan, or even in Bangladesh and any other region countries like this. Given the geopolitical dynamics and the strategic decisions and alignments, but do you think there will be a certain degree of backlash for the developing nations who are actually vying for Chinese investments? They're vying for infrastructural developments of the country that their governments cannot fund. And do you think that it invites problem, and the nature of the relationship between China and especially the South Asian nations and across the Indo-Pacific Indian Ocean region is counterproductive and exploitative?
Well, it really depends on the state you're talking about, because some states have been quite reasonable and cautious in their approach to China, some have not. And not everything can be blamed on China. I mean, clearly, in the case of Pakistan, for example, the first country to be blamed about the situation and the potential for a debt trap is the responsibility of Pakistan itself. And if you look at the way China is responding to Pakistan's demand, China is extremely cautious not to go too far. First of all, it doesn't overinvest. A country in which stability doesn't, I mean, it is highly skeptical anyway, and it doesn't want to lose its own investment in any case. This is more or less the same thing, but we have different situation depending where you are. I'm sure that you have in mind the case of Sri Lanka. I mean, the debt in Sri Lanka was not primarily Chinese, and the debt was much larger than this, and China was a part of it, and China became the dominant part of this. But I mean, the primary responsibility was the Sri Lankan government, who decided to launch a series of useless investment against the advice of international organization, against the advice of a number of countries to which it did ask them to invest before it did turn to China. Canada was one of them. India was one of them and refused, and on solid ground, by the way, and so on and so forth. But I mean, there is also a responsibility of the states themselves. Bangladesh is a slightly different case, which seems to be slightly more cautious in this approach. Whether it be capable of remaining that cautious over time is a different thing, and we'll see. But I mean, there are as many interpretations, as many cases as you can imagine, depending whom you talk to and what countries are actually doing.
Just a reminder into this particular interview that we have that Sri Lanka has actually leased it's one of its port to one of the Chinese-led state companies to a 99-year-old lease, 1 year short of being a century. So this is like the way China is expanding, especially, yeah, it is also related to with domestic economic mismanagements as well, and especially with regard to the debt that these countries have accumulated. There
Yes,
is
but
a
I mean,
situation where we can see economic dependency of smaller nations on big investors and prominent investors, especially when we consider with China in this particular region, infringing on sovereignty and decision-making capabilities. And Sri Lanka in the current state, and be it considered Sri Lanka, be it considered Pakistan, they're in a much they're in a big economic mess. So how do we consider this economic leverage to influence political and military decisions when we consider big powers like China interfering in this region
no,
to
I mean,
distort
you
political and military factors to make sure that they can achieve economic benefits to their end?
No, but I mean, first of all, the responsibility of the management of those countries are their own government. I mean, and there are two questions. There is the question of who demanded for those investments, and this is in both the case that you mentioned, the national state. It was Sri Lanka on the one side, Pakistan on the other. For CPEC in the case of the later, for Ambatota for Sri Lanka. And there is, of course, the opportunistic use of the debt by a country like China who build the infrastructure in both cases. Okay, uh, again, the Rajapaksa family in Sri Lanka decided to build the Ambatota port, for which there was absolutely no need because he wanted a major infrastructure in his own district. I mean, but before he turned to China, he turned to Canada, he turned to another country, which name I don't remember, he turned to India, all refused on purely economic ground, and they were right to do so. Now, what happened later on is that it is a matter of investment, so therefore everything is fungible. So whatever investment you do means debt, debt means dependency, and dependency up to a certain level means whatever the creditor wants it to become. So when the Sri Lankan government was no longer capable of paying for the China's bill, China decided to do things otherwise, and hence the lease that we have seen. We are facing an increasingly similar situation in Pakistan, and Pakistan is trying not to fall into that, but it will be in a very hard situation to avoid that. Now, how can we do that? First of all, by having some reasonable investment. I mean, if you start investing in projects which are not economy viable, you're likely to end up in a level of investment which will not be sustainable. That's one aspect of it. How can you mitigate that? By listening to the experts of international organization, by listening to the expert of the country to ask for investment too. If they don't want to do it, it's usually because they see there is no profit to be made and therefore that the project is not sustainable. And by eventually, if the investment is really needed, offering a variety of financial possibilities. I mean, this is what, in particular, the Europeans are trying to do with the Global Gateway program and so on. And this is the way things have worked, can work, but it is much more difficult to set up than it seems. But I mean, if we speak of responsibility of the situation, this is often the responsibility of the state which asks for the infrastructure, whether it was used opportunities in an opportunistic manner by China when China did create they build infrastructure. This is a reality, but this is not necessarily the cause of the problem or not the initial one. And we can't confuse everything because this just increased the tension for absolutely no reason. But there is a situation which is difficult enough to think. Now, this has a very practical implication. This is not just a matter of money, that if you buy back the debt of, let's say, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, or anybody else, you will bring those countries outside the control of China, because it means that you still have government in the middle who can play because they just want to balance the big bully next door. who want to balance this neighbor of theirs, which they think is too demanding, which they think is too important for them, and want to balance their foreign policy. Rightly or wrongly, and I'm not disputing that here. What I'm just saying is this, it is a mistake not to accompany financial measures, such as buying by the debt, for example, without a political accompaniment of all this.
That calls for a very suitable explanations when you talk about the current relationship between China, the third countries, and the major powers. But now let's come down to the economic dependency. I do agree with your points, especially the economic decisions that the countries, small nations make are suitably theirs. But considering the 99-year-old lease that has been taken by Chinese companies, and there were very previous reports that the China were sending its naval fleets near the Indian coastline, especially when they were utilizing the economic dependency of smaller nations to make sure that they can continue surveillance in the Bay of Bengal region and get away with it. So in that sense, how do you think that the investors and economic relations can play a role, especially in determining naval cooperation and making up solid political and military decisions? How do you think that the two can be interrelated with?
Sorry, I didn't get the question really. What exactly are you asking? Because again, you're mixing up several things. Can you repeat the question?
The question was basically how do you interrelate economic and military relations out of it, and how do you think? Because I recently gave an example of how China has been utilized Hambantota port to place one of its naval vessels very near the Indian Ocean region. So how do you think that the political and military decisions are getting influenced in the regional dynamics and the security cooperations of this
The
region?
answer is in the question. There was dependency on Sri Lanka on China for the reimbursement of the debt. And because there was a dependency and because Sri Lanka was unable to reimburse this debt, then of course there was the lead. And because there was a lead, China was in a position to have any of its boats make port calls in Sri Lanka and so on, which of course made India extremely uneasy because it was far too close to its own thing. More recently, we have had research vessels, and this is still a matter of controversy. The problem in all this is not strictly legal or anything, and therefore this is exactly what we are talking about, the security dilemma at the very beginning. Now, how do you manage this? There is no easy answer to that because, again, states are sovereign, and whether we agree or disagree with their decision, this is something that they can decide to do. Now, look at what India has done with Sri Lanka. There has been a number of discussion in order to prevent precisely Sri Lankan port for being used by war vessel or things like that in the thing. This has been a matter of controversy. This is something difficult, and nobody has been able to right now to really forbid China successfully to come into it. And in terms of international law, there is no reason to do so. Strategically, it does make sense for India to try to prevent it, but so far, the law does allow Sri Lanka to do what it wants with its own ports. And that's the way things work. So this is a matter of discussion and negotiation between the Sri Lankan and the Indian government, or with any other government that may be tempted to do the same thing. And this is exactly what's happening. But there is no easy solution out of that too. And this is not just because you will buy back the debt of such or such country that those things will not happen.
Let's come down to the question of political economic investments and the sustainable developmental goals, which is considered to be a topic that concerns many of the global South nations and especially in many of the nations in the global North as well. Like, what measures do you think political and economic investments can be done in the smaller nations, especially when we consider the importance of sustainable developments in leading long-term dependencies and regional tensions as well? If we interrelate sustainable developmental goals with economic investments and economic relations, most of them have become much more directed towards zip trap, directed towards increased investments. but also this also threatens regional stability as well. How do you interrelate sustainable developmental goals, especially in the small South Asian nations, with the regional stabilities and economic investments and the debt trap which is currently in play in the region?
Well, we turn in circle here because we always say the same thing. State want a certain number of infrastructure because they want to do things, because they want to transition towards greener energy, so they'll be less affected by climate change and so on and so forth and so on. They need to invest for that. If you want to transition from diesel energy to solar one, it means that you'll have to invest in solar panel and so on and so forth. What you need is the money for it, and you'll turn to the country that will be ready to provide you with A, the source of funding, and B, the technology to do that. So China is one of the actors. The best way to do it and the most efficient way is to provide those states in need with the financial facilities as well as with the technology at an affordable price. And that's where China is a hard competitor, because it is capable of providing many countries with cheap technology. I was mentioning solar energy, cheap solar panel. 80% of the solar panel which are produced in the world today are produced in China. That includes a number of solar panels which are being used in India these days, and so on and so forth. So don't expect smaller country to be in a capacity to necessarily resist this offer. Now, what can be done is precisely, first of all, expertise provided by international organizations. Many of them are there for that, and their advice are to be followed, maybe not systematically, but at least they're worth considering at the very least. Second, create financial facilities. A number of countries which have fallen into debt trap did so, turned to China for one single reason. They were successful enough not to qualify, for example, for the European credit facilities because they were too successful. But I mean, when they did turn to actual market trade, then it became too expensive for them. So they turned to China, which are providing a cheaper alternative. So, the solution are to be found within this. Can we provide cheaper alternatives? Can we provide cheaper loan rates and that kind of thing? That will be a great help for this country. Now, this is for the funding of those projects. Now, as for the feasibility and the sustainability, it has to be examined whether those projects made sense. I mean, this is not the same thing to speak of energy transition, for example, and to speak of the creation of totally useless ports such as Ambatata. And the two lead or can lead potentially to a similar result, which is excessive indebtedness and what you call the debt trap diplomacy, which places a country into the hands of a bigger and stronger one with what we suspect ulterior motive for the region. So, but basically we can do it by providing alternative financial facility, providing better advice and be present in the region.
Now let's come down to the interrelations of green economy and especially the importance of green energy and energy security into the domain of the Belt and Road Initiative of China. The Belt and Road Initiative and the energy security relations in China, the basic interrelationship between these two. And we found out when the Belt and Road Initiative was to connect the underprivileged backgrounds of China's west to the east, and now it is extended beyond in Central Asia, West Asia, and other regions as well, to make sure that they can have they can sustainably invest in infrastructure over there and bring oil into the country. How do you think that with the advent of green energy, green economy, and the flotations of such concepts can trigger a change in the Belt and Road initiatives and the basic concepts behind it? How do you think that the China can take ahead in the near future?
I'm not clear, because what we have seen is China initially didn't care about the green economy. Then China became very aware of it because its own population wanted it. Then we face a situation where China was becoming green internally, but didn't care outside, as if carbon emission could stop at the border. And we've seen a number of things like that. Now there is a demand also in the recipient countries for also greener energy and so on. So that's where the future lies. Again, the dimension that I think, but maybe I'm wrong, that your question I'm missing is the agency of the recipient countries, the country which are in between, the countries which China is connecting with itself or with the rest of the world and so on. And depending on what they do or don't do, depending on what they want or don't want to do, then things are going to be very different. And the BRI will definitely be obliged to be part of it. First of all, there is much less money invested on that now than there was some years ago. Let's see how the whole thing evolves. But I mean, again, you cannot see that in isolation. This is not something which is strictly imposed by China upon third party. Once the relation is created, yes, China exploits it, and for its own sake, because it doesn't do anything for free, but no one ever does in this world. And so on. But I mean, don't forget that China is not the one who decides about everything. There are recipient countries. They are the ones who are asking for things. And that's changing a lot of things.
Now, let's come down to another question. China is not actually participative in with regard to climate initiatives, but it is growing internally, as you have mentioned. Why do you think there is a discrepancy between its internal policies and external policy, and what other countries can learn, especially from such a push by China?
What other country can learn is that, China care or doesn't care about them. It's also what those countries are currently willing, able to pay, and so on. For example, when China stops building coal plants in his own country and start building them in Pakistan in the context of CPEC, then there are questions to be asked. In other words, China doesn't really care about the Pakistani population. But at the same time, Pakistan is not necessarily in a position to buy better technology in order to replace them. So we are in that sort of a thing. And yes, China doesn't care about what's going on beyond its border, provided it doesn't affect it. But as soon as it does start affecting it, then it starts reacting as well. And we have seen China, which is at the same time part of a problem, like we all are to some extent, because we keep emitting carbon and so on, because we still need to grow our economy and we haven't yet translated towards completely clean economy. And at the same time is part of the solution, because if it simply does stop its own emission, limit its own emission, it does contribute to reduce the global warming. And if it does so, it does help itself, of course, but not only itself. So this question, them against us, yes, it says something about the consideration that China have or doesn't have for its neighbors or whatever countries it deals with, but it doesn't stop there. There is a very practical dimension of it, which is if you do reduce the problem in China, you do reduce it somewhere else as well. Like if you do reduce the problem in India, you do reduce it elsewhere as well, like in Europe, like in the United States. So things should be understood this way. And this is a process which is taking place. We have seen the kind of behavior that I was mentioning as frankly not very correct vis-a-vis a country which is being considered an ally to Pakistan. But I mean, at the same time, the Chinese are pragmatic. You get from them what you pay to them, and so on and so forth. So that's the way things operate.
So just to add a bit to discussions as well, that India and China being one of the topmost targets when it considers with regard to emitting coal energy and emitting out of it. Now let's come down to the questions of exclusive economic zones into the region and the geopolitical tensions out of it. When we departed from the discussions around energy security, one of the prime examples of the dispute is between China and the Philippines in the South China Sea region. How do you think that we can prevent such disputes, especially when we consider with regard to the exclusive economic zones? Such issues have now escalated into diplomatic and somewhat towards military and military and maritime confrontations in the region. And how do you think we can adopt a certain degree of mechanisms to prevent such eventualities in the near future? Do you think there is a necessity that China
To
can play to,
prevent it where? To prevent those eventualities where? Because, you know, you're speaking of a very specific situation. China, Philippines. You could speak of a similar situation, China, Vietnam, China, other countries in the South China Sea. But it so happens that China claims roughly 90% of the South China Sea. And I'm not going to discuss here whether this is right or wrong. I don't believe it is, to make things clear. But I mean, this is a very specific situation to the South China Sea. You don't have a similar situation in the Indian Ocean, for example, where international law has been respected. There was a conflict of the same nature between India and Bangladesh. This has been solved thanks to a ruling of the International Court of Arbitration, The Hague, and the two parties agreed to follow the recommendation of the award. And, you know, the simplest way to answer your question is you prevent that sort of situation by respecting international law. It so happened that China has signed the same treaties as everybody else, which is UNCLOS, and is interpreting it in a way which is contrary to the spirit of the thing. But it doesn't have to happen elsewhere. Now, there are other things that you can do in order to prevent those things. I mean, to develop, first of all, the development of the political relation with the state of the Indian Ocean, for example, capacity building in order to help them control their own water, make sure that things similar or things which could have a potential effect on their EEZ and so on do not happen. And we speak of, well, you mentioned piracy initially. We can mention IU fishing, which has a lot to do with EEZ, and who comes in with different consequences than the one in the South China Sea, but nevertheless, in some places, geopolitical consequences, and so on. But the basic of all that is the respect of UNCLOS. And the consequence of all that is develop whatever means are necessary to enforce the respect of UNCLOS. The problem everywhere in the world, and not just in the South China Sea or the Indian Ocean, is the lack of capacity of a number of little states. And because there is a lack of capacity, there is no capacity to enforce the law. And that's the major problem of international law generally. This is a specific problem of the international law of the sea, probably even more so than general international law, if there is something as such.
That well sums up the point, especially now let's come down to the role of the United States in the region. How does United States can play a role, especially in the developmental cooperations of the Pacific Island states and the countries in the global south? When we come down to the involvement of China in this regard, how do you think that the United States can change a policy towards the global South nations to make sure that they do not depend too much on China, but to the West, but to the United States and to the liberal international order? How do you think that this can be done?
Precisely by giving those countries what they need, or by helping them building what the capacity that they need. But this is not just a matter of infrastructure, just a matter of money, just a matter of everything. This is also the kind of cooperation that China is building sometimes with those countries. I mean, look, with the Solomon Islands, this was all about a police cooperation agreement. And through this police cooperation agreement, China developed its presence and influence in the country. Elsewhere, this is a different thing. And the United States is not the only actor. I would argue that a country like Australia, where I do live today, has a lot to do in the South Pacific and do consider it its own sphere of influence and responsibility to a large extent. And that's what they do. They try to help wherever is needed and so on, maintain a political dialogue with all those countries and so on. If you ask me whether the United States should do the same, probably yes. And the US does it to an extent. The US can't be everywhere either. Now, if we extend to the Indian Ocean, this is a slightly different situation. India is trying to do that more or less successfully. The US is still there, but unwilling to be present everywhere and willing to focus much more on the Pacific, which it does consider its own priority. So that's where things happen. The way it should be done depends on every country and the needs of each and every country. And that's the way things happen or do not happen. But it's also, again, let me emphasize the role of the states themselves. This is not just China and the US or China and India or China and whoever. In between, you do have recipient states who have agency, who can decide by themselves what they want or what they don't want, and who are happy to play the rivalry for their own favor. That's where the main problem right now is, more than the amount of money that either China, the US, India, or whoever is willing to spend anywhere in this space.
That's a fair argument, but I have a counterpoint to it as well. China, with the help of its new state-owned agencies as well, has to a certain extent taken over the municipal corporations and some of its activities in the Maldivian capital of Male. But I'm not coming down to the point. I will right now totally focus on the maritime domain awareness and the security perspective of these regions. How effective do you think that the United Nations conventions of the law and sea can play a role, especially when we consider about the conflicts worldwide and the effects of its maritime security? How do you think that the Indian Ocean and the Indian Ocean regions can be created as a whole, especially when we see it is to create a more secure and a region which is much more resistant towards global conflicts?
I mean, again, there are several questions in your question, but let's stay with let's not, I mean, the UNCLOS sets the norms. It says what the relationship should be according to a number of norms, which had been agreed upon by all the signatories, including China. Now, the problem is it doesn't say anything about the way it should be protected. It just says the norm. Now, the real problem is precisely that the capacity to enforce the norms does not necessarily exist or does not exist everywhere. And that's where the main problem is. Now, if you want to speak about the way that plays out in the Indian Ocean, then you already know it in a very different way from the South China Sea for two different reasons. In the South China Sea, you do have Chinese claim over, again, some 90% of the entire sea, something which doesn't exist in the Indian Ocean. But you have a similar problem, which is lack of capacity on most of the littoral shores. Perhaps more in the Indian Ocean than in the South China Sea in many respects, because the entire African coast is almost devoid of capacity and sometimes simply of maritime culture. So, if you do have a norm, but if you do have the law, but you can't enforce it, then you do have a big question mark. So what you can do is set up coalition. You set up coalition in order to intervene directly. And you have had the task force, for example, anti-terrorism, anti-piracy in the Northwest Indian Ocean. You have had Atalanta against piracy in other part of the Indian Ocean, to which other countries are called to participate in, and so on. You could develop also, we can imagine having capacity building in many of the littoral states of the Indian Ocean in a much larger scale than it is the case now. Now, there will still be a problem, which is the number of assets they do have or they do not have, more to the point. And there this is something which can be solved only over time. So it will be solved partly by mutualization of the asset when the assets exist, but mutualization can exist only if you do have something to mutualize. So if part of the Indian Ocean is too poor in assets in order to mutualize anything, then whatever you call mutualization will just be dilution, and so on and so forth. Now, countries like India have assets of their own that they do mobilize to protect their own region, try to do some capacity building in and around its own periphery and so on. And that's the way to go about it. But there is no easy solution that will just make sure that what happened in the South China Sea will never happen in the Indian Ocean.
Now let's come down to the final questions of the day, especially where we have talked a bit about the geopolitical and the maritime security dynamics of the region. How do you think? What do you think about United States as approach towards Indo-Pacific region since it started its whole narrative of the Indo-Pacific regions, and Barack Obama's the famous quote was about pivot to Asia. How do you think it has evolved since then, and what will be its approach in the current context, especially when we talk about the region as a whole?
First of all, it's not the US which first started to speak about the Indo-Pacific, it's Japan. And it did speak about the Indo-Pacific in a very different perspective than the one that we are facing now. It was essentially a way of, how could I say, ensure a compatibility between its policy with China, protected investment in China, and abroad. Now, the second country which did develop it in 2013 was Australia. Again, it was a way to articulate its Pacific policy with its Indian Ocean policy. But the goal was not to antagonize China. None of those two countries wants to do that. It really became what we know under the Indo-Pacific in 2017, that is not under Obama, but under Trump, which gave the term a much more antagonistic meaning. Now, how it's going to play out, that is not clear. We have seen it started by a trade war, which did not change much after the change of government, the change of administration in the US. How this is likely to evolve, I'm not really sure. We are not seeing any real sign that the tension will ease in the region. The question of Taiwan is central to everyone, because this will definitely be the ultimate test of both the Chinese resolve and the US resolve on the other one, and of the solidity of the Western alliance on the with the US. But I mean, no one knows what's going to happen there now. We hear a lot of things, more or less alarming, more or less reassuring, but I mean, no one knows, for example, if and when a conflict will happen over Taiwan. We hear a lot of statements, yes. More or less interested, by the way, because the number of people also have a vested interest in the statement that they make. But no one can say with any degree of certainty that the Chinese will suddenly decide to invite Taiwan and that the whole space will go in flame. That is not the case so far. Is the risk there? Yes. Can we take for granted that things are going to go this way? No. Right? And the situation that we face now is a very fluid one, where we do have tension which are continuing and so on, but at the same time, we do see willingness not to let them go completely out of hand and so on. How it will evolve, I'm not sure. I don't think anybody can be any sure. Diplomacy on both sides trying to avoid that. There are also ways for China to coerce Taiwan, for example, below the conflict thresholds. How would we react collectively in that case is a different story. It depends the mean and so on. So the story is not written yet. The role of the US will be central, obviously, because this is the number one military power in the world, not necessarily in number, but at least qualitatively. And second, it is still by far the largest economy of the world. It has also a federating role with everybody else. It can also play a negative role if it does go too far in this sense. Now, we will probably all agree that the claim over Taiwan and so on is a Chinese one and not a Western one. But I mean, this is the dialectic. This is not the fight for evil against the right and so or vice versa. So that's where we stand today.
Thank you for joining our sessions. And in this particular sessions, we have discussed a lot about not only about the geopolitical and the military dynamics of the Indo-Pacific region, but we have also discussed about length about green economy, emission targets, and with very degrees of sustainable developmental goals. And thanks a lot to all our viewers who is and will be watching this particular interview, and keep watching Geointerview at the Geostrata.
Bye.